29th annual Grammy Awards were in full swing, and 23-year-old Whitney Houston was living what most people would call a fairy tale. She had just won her first Grammy for Best Pop Vocal Performance, and the entire music industry was watching her meteoric rise with a mixture of admiration and envy. Her voice was being called a once-in-a-generation gift, and her face was on every magazine cover in America. But what happened in a cramped backstage hallway that night would haunt Whitney for the rest of her life. As she walked toward her dressing room, still clutching her Grammy Award and floating on pure adrenaline, she turned a corner and came face to face with the woman many considered the greatest voice in music history. Aretha Franklin stood there in a stunning gold gown, and the moment their eyes met, something shifted in the air. What Aretha said to Whitney in those next 3 minutes would prove to be the most important conversation of Whitney's entire career, a prophetic warning that Whitney would ignore until it was far too late. If you want to discover the hidden moments that reveal the real cost of fame and the warnings we wish we had listened to, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story will show you that sometimes the people who love us most can see our destruction coming long before we do. To understand the magnitude of what happened that night backstage at the Grammys, you need to understand who Whitney Houston was in 1987. She wasn't just another talented singer. She was being positioned as the crossover artist who would bridge the gap between black and white audiences in a way that no one had done since Diana Ross. Her debut album had spent 14 weeks at #1, and her follow-up album, simply titled Whitney, had made history by debuting at #1 on the Billboard 200. The first album by a female artist ever to do so. But the pressure on Whitney's shoulders was crushing in ways that most people couldn't see. Her mother, Cissy Houston, was a legendary gospel singer who had performed with everyone from Elvis Presley to Aretha Franklin herself. Cissy had groomed Whitney from childhood to be perfect, drilling into her that anything less than excellence was failure. Whitney's voice lessons started at age 7, and by the time she was a teenager, she was singing backup for her mother at concerts and recording sessions. The record executive who discovered Whitney, Clive Davis, had equally high expectations. He had crafted her image meticulously, choosing her songs, her wardrobe, even coaching her on how to speak in interviews. Whitney was brilliant, beautiful, and blessed with a voice that seemed to come directly from heaven. But she was also becoming something else, a manufactured product designed to appeal to the widest possible audience. Behind the glamorous facade, Whitney was struggling with an identity crisis that would eventually destroy her. In the black community, she was facing accusations of not being black enough, of selling out to appeal to white audiences. Her music was called too pop, too polished, too safe. At the same time, she was dealing with intense pressure to maintain a wholesome, girl-next-door image that felt increasingly false to who she really was. Whitney rarely spoke about these pressures publicly, but those close to her saw the cracks forming. Her longtime friend and backup singer, Bebe Winans, later recalled that Whitney would sometimes break down in tears after performances, overwhelmed by the weight of everyone's expectations. She felt like she was living someone else's life, playing a character that looked like her but didn't feel like her. That February night in 1987, Whitney was at a crossroads, though she didn't fully realize it yet. She had achieved the kind of success that most artists only dream about, but she was also beginning to feel trapped by that very success. The Grammy win should have been a moment of pure joy, but as she walked backstage clutching that golden gramophone, she felt strangely empty. Something was missing, though she couldn't quite name what it was. That's when she saw Aretha Franklin standing in that hallway, and everything changed. Aretha Franklin in 1987 was at a very different place in her career than Whitney Houston. At 44 years old, Aretha had already lived through 2 decades of unprecedented success, personal tragedy, and hard-won wisdom about the music industry. She had earned 18 Grammy Awards, topped the charts countless times, and become known worldwide as the Queen of Soul. But she had also paid a devastating price for that success. Aretha's journey through fame had been brutal in ways that the public rarely saw. She had endured an abusive first marriage to her manager, Ted White, who controlled every aspect of her career and life. She had struggled with alcoholism, weight fluctuations, and severe stage fright that sometimes left her unable to perform. She had watched friends and fellow artists destroy themselves with drugs and alcohol, and she had seen how the music industry chewed up talented black women and spit them out when they were no longer profitable. By 1987, Aretha had developed a sixth sense for recognizing when a young artist was being positioned for the same kind of destruction she had narrowly survived. And when she looked at Whitney Houston, she saw all the warning signs that she had once ignored in herself. The too perfect image, the people-pleasing smile, the way Whitney's eyes never quite matched the joy on her face. Aretha had been watching Whitney's rise with a mixture of pride and concern. She knew Whitney's mother, Sissy, from their years singing together, and she recognized the familiar pattern of a talented daughter trying desperately to live up to an impossible standard. She had seen it before with other young singers, and she knew how it usually ended. That night at the Grammys, Aretha had actually been looking for Whitney. She had something important to say, a warning that she hoped might save this brilliant young woman from the path of self-destruction that had claimed so many others. When she spotted Whitney in that backstage hallway, she knew the moment had come. Whitney's first instinct when she saw Aretha Franklin was pure starstruck awe. Despite her own success, she still viewed Aretha as royalty, as the voice that had defined what it meant to be a soul singer. Her mother had played Aretha's records constantly throughout Whitney's childhood, and Whitney knew every run, every note, every emotional inflection in songs like Respect and Natural Woman. Whitney approached Aretha with the Grammy still clutched in her hand, ready to express her admiration and gratitude for everything Aretha had contributed to music. But before Whitney could speak, Aretha held up her hand in a gesture that was both gentle and commanding. "Congratulations on your award, baby," Aretha said, her voice carrying that distinctive warmth that had comforted millions through her music. "But I need to talk to you about something more important than any Grammy." Whitney was caught off guard. She had expected pleasantries, maybe some brief advice about the industry. But there was something in Aretha's eyes, a seriousness that made her stomach tighten with unexpected anxiety. "Yes, ma'am," Whitney replied, her voice automatically taking on the respectful tone her mother had taught her to use with elders. Aretha gestured to a quiet corner away from the backstage chaos, and the two women moved there, creating a small bubble of privacy in the midst of the Grammy celebration. What happened next would be seared into Whitney's memory for the rest of her life. "I know what they're doing to you," Aretha began, her voice low but intense. "I can see it in your eyes, baby. They're turning you into a product, a pretty package that they can sell to white America. And you're letting them do it because you think that's what success looks like." Whitney felt defensive immediately. "Miss Aretha, I'm just trying to make good music and—" "No," Aretha interrupted firmly. "You're trying to make everyone happy. Your mama, your record label, the critics, the fans. You're singing other people's songs, wearing other people's clothes, living other people's version of who Whitney Houston should be. And I'm here to tell you something that nobody else will tell you." Aretha paused, and her next words came out with the weight of hard-earned wisdom and genuine fear for Whitney's future. "Success without soul is suicide." The words hung in the air between them, and Whitney felt like she had been slapped. Her carefully constructed smile faltered, and for a moment, her real feelings showed on her face. Confusion, hurt, and a flash of recognition that Aretha was touching on something Whitney had been trying not to think about. "Every time you sing a song that doesn't come from your true self, you kill a little piece of your soul," Aretha continued. "Every time you pretend to be something you're not to make other people comfortable, you lose yourself a little more. I've seen it happen to so many talented people, and I'm seeing it happen to you right now." Whitney's eyes were beginning to fill with tears, but she fought to keep them from falling. She couldn't break down here, not at the Grammys, not with people walking past who might see. "But I'm successful," Whitney said quietly. "Isn't that what matters?" Aretha's expression softened with something that looked like pity. "Baby, I've had all the success in the world, and I can tell you from experience that success means nothing if you lose yourself to get it. The industry will take everything you have to give, and when you have nothing left, they'll move on to the next young girl with a pretty voice." Then Aretha said something that would echo in Whitney's mind for years to come. "You can have all the #1 records in the world, but if you don't know who you are when the music stops, you've got nothing. And worse, you'll start looking for that feeling of being yourself in all the wrong places. Drugs, alcohol, bad relationships, anything to fill the emptiness where your true self used to be." Whitney wanted to argue, to defend herself and her choices. But something about Aretha's words was cutting through all her defenses and touching a truth she had been avoiding. She did feel empty. She did feel like she was playing a character, and she was terrified of what would happen if she ever stopped performing. "What should I do?" Whitney asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Aretha took Whitney's hands in hers, and the gesture felt almost maternal. "Start singing your truth, baby. Stop letting other people tell you who you should be. Find songs that speak to your real experience, not just what sells records. And most importantly, learn to say no. No to the drugs they'll offer you to keep up the pace. No to the people who want to control you. No to anything that asks you to sacrifice your soul for success." "I don't know if I can," Whitney admitted. And in that moment, she was being more honest than she had been in months. "I know you can," Aretha said firmly. "Because you have a gift from God, and God doesn't give gifts like yours to weak people. He gives them to warriors. But you have to choose to fight for yourself because nobody else will." Before Whitney could respond, Aretha was called away for her own performance. But before she left, she pulled Whitney close and whispered one final warning directly in her ear. "Remember what I told you tonight, because there will come a day when you'll wish you had listened." Then Aretha was gone, swept back into the chaos of the Grammy production, leaving Whitney standing alone in that backstage hallway, clutching her Grammy Award and feeling more lost than she had ever felt in her life. In the days and weeks following the Grammy Awards, Whitney found herself thinking constantly about Aretha's words. "Success without soul is suicide." The phrase played on a loop in her mind during recording sessions, during photo shoots, during the endless promotional appearances that had become her life. Part of Whitney wanted desperately to heed Aretha's warning. She wanted to start making different choices, to assert more control over her music and her image. But every time she considered speaking up, she encountered the massive machine that had been built around her success. Her mother's expectations, Clive Davis's vision, the record label's investment, the fans' adoration. All of it depended on her continuing to be exactly who they needed her to be. Whitney's friend and hairdresser, Ellen Lavar, later recalled this period as the beginning of Whitney's internal struggle. After the Grammys that year, something changed in Whitney. She seemed more conflicted, more aware of the prison that her success had become. But she didn't know how to escape it without disappointing everyone who depended on her. Instead of confronting the issues Aretha had raised, Whitney began to develop coping mechanisms that would eventually destroy her. She started drinking more frequently, initially just to relax after performances, but gradually becoming a daily habit. She became more withdrawn from her family and old friends, surrounding herself instead with people who enabled her increasingly destructive behavior. The success continued to mount. Her 1987 album, Whitney, became the first album by a female artist to debut at #1. She won more awards, sold more records, and became one of the most recognizable faces in the world. But with each new achievement, she felt further away from the person she had been before fame. In 1989, Whitney won another Grammy, this time for Best Pop Vocal Performance for her version of I Wanna Dance with Somebody. At the ceremony, she saw Aretha again, and their eyes met across the room. Aretha gave her a look that asked a silent question. "Have you started fighting for yourself yet?" Whitney looked away, unable to meet the Queen of Soul's knowing gaze. The answer was obvious, and both women knew it. The early 1990s marked the beginning of Whitney's public unraveling, though few people recognized the warning signs at the time. In 1992, she married singer Bobby Brown, a relationship that would become infamous for its toxicity and mutual destruction. But what most people didn't understand was that Whitney was attracted to Bobby precisely because he represented everything her carefully constructed image was not. He was raw, unpolished, unapologetic about who he was. With Bobby, Whitney felt like she could finally stop pretending. But instead of finding freedom in that authenticity, Whitney found addiction. Bobby introduced her to harder drugs, and what had started as occasional marijuana use escalated to regular cocaine consumption. The drugs initially made Whitney feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. They quieted the voice in her head that constantly criticized her for not being good enough, not being real enough, not being herself. Robin Crawford, Whitney's closest friend and rumored romantic partner, watched with horror as the woman she loved disappeared into addiction. Whitney was running from herself, Robin later said. She was trying to escape the pressure of being perfect, but instead of finding herself, she lost herself completely in the drugs. By the mid-1990s, Whitney's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. She missed recording sessions, showed up late to performances, and when she did perform, her once flawless voice was showing signs of damage from years of substance abuse. The media began to notice, and the same industry that had built her up started tearing her down with gleeful cruelty. Through it all, Aretha's words echoed in Whitney's mind like a curse. Success without soul is suicide. Whitney had achieved unimaginable success, but she had indeed sacrificed her soul to get it. And now, just as Aretha had predicted, she was trying to fill that emptiness with drugs and a destructive relationship. In 1999, Whitney's mother, Sissy, staged an intervention, bringing in family members and friends to confront Whitney about her drug use. Whitney sat through hours of tearful pleas and angry accusations, and when it was finally her turn to speak, she said something that revealed how deeply Aretha's warning had stayed with her. "Aretha Franklin told me this would happen," Whitney said, her voice hollow. "She told me I was killing my soul for success, and I didn't listen. Now I don't even know who I am anymore when I'm not high." The intervention didn't work. Whitney went through the motions of treatment, but she wasn't ready to truly change. She couldn't face the fundamental question that Aretha had asked her. Who are you when the music stops? Because without the drugs, without the performance, without the image, Whitney genuinely didn't know who she was anymore. The year 2000 brought what should have been a triumphant moment in Whitney's career. She was set to perform at the Academy Awards, singing her hit song, "I Believe in You and Me." But by then, Whitney's drug use had escalated to a level that made functioning nearly impossible. She was consuming cocaine daily, sometimes multiple times a day, and her weight had dropped to a dangerously low level. The Academy Awards performance was a disaster. Whitney's voice, once the most reliable instrument in music, cracked and wavered. Her appearance shocked viewers. She looked gaunt, her skin had lost its luster, and her eyes had a glazed, distant quality that even television makeup couldn't hide. The internet, still relatively new but growing rapidly, exploded with speculation about what was wrong with Whitney Houston. After that performance, Whitney largely withdrew from the public eye. She stopped touring, stopped recording, and spent most of her time isolated in her home with Bobby Brown, both of them spiraling deeper into addiction. The few friends who still had access to her reported that Whitney was a shell of her former self, paranoid, volatile, and barely recognizable as the confident young woman who had once dominated the music industry. It was during this dark period that Whitney reached out to Aretha Franklin for the first time since their backstage encounter 13 years earlier. She called Aretha's home in Detroit at 3 a.m, obviously intoxicated or high, and when Aretha answered, Whitney broke down completely. "You were right," Whitney sobbed into the phone. "You told me and I didn't listen. I don't know who I am anymore. I can't sing anymore. I've destroyed everything for success that doesn't even mean anything." Aretha, despite the late hour and the years of silence between them, listened with the patience and compassion that had always defined her character. When Whitney finally exhausted herself with crying and rambling confessions, Aretha spoke with the same gentle firmness she had used backstage at the Grammys. "Baby, it's not too late," Aretha said. "You can still find yourself again. But you have to do the hard work of figuring out who you are without all the noise. Without the drugs, without Bobby, without your mother's expectations or Clive's vision. Just you and God, figuring out who Whitney Houston really is." "I'm scared," Whitney admitted. "What if there's nothing there? What if I destroyed that person completely?" "That person is still in there," Aretha assured her. "Your soul might be wounded, but it's not dead. God doesn't give up on his children, even when they give up on themselves. But you have to choose recovery, baby. You have to choose yourself." They talked for 2 more hours that night, and for a brief moment, Whitney felt a flicker of hope that maybe she could find her way back. But when she woke up the next day, the fear returned. The idea of facing herself without drugs, without distractions, without the protective armor of her public persona, was more terrifying than continuing to destroy herself. She didn't call Aretha again. She wasn't ready to do the work that recovery required. It would take another 5 years, and hitting absolute rock bottom before Whitney finally committed to getting sober. In 2006, she divorced Bobby Brown and entered serious treatment for her addictions. The process was agonizing. Whitney had to confront not just her substance abuse, but all the underlying issues that had led her to drugs in the first place. The impossible expectations, the lost sense of self, the years of pretending to be someone she wasn't. During her recovery, Whitney often thought about Aretha's warning. In interviews years later, she would reference that backstage conversation as a turning point she had been too young and too scared to recognize at the time. "Aretha tried to save me from myself," Whitney said in a 2009 interview with Oprah Winfrey. "She saw what I was doing to myself, and she tried to warn me, but I thought I knew better. I thought I could handle the pressure, handle the expectations, handle being everything to everyone. I was wrong." Whitney's comeback attempt in 2009 with the album I Look to You was both triumphant and tragic. The album debuted at #1, proving that the public still loved her. But her voice, once the most powerful instrument in music, was permanently damaged from years of drug abuse and strain. She could still sing, but the effortless, soaring notes that had defined her early career were gone forever. Still, there were moments of genuine growth and self-discovery. Whitney began choosing songs that reflected her real experiences rather than just commercial viability. She spoke more honestly in interviews about her struggles and her journey. She was slowly, painfully, finding the authentic self that Aretha had urged her to protect all those years ago. In 2011, Whitney and Aretha appeared together at a tribute concert for a mutual friend. It was the first time they had been in the same room since Whitney's recovery, and when they saw each other, both women began to cry. They embraced for a long moment, and when they pulled apart, Whitney whispered, "I finally listened." Aretha smiled, tears running down her face. "I can see that, baby. I can see your soul shining through again." That night, they sang together for the first and only time in their careers, a duet of bridge over troubled water that brought the entire audience to tears. Whitney's voice wasn't what it once had been, but it carried something it had often lacked in her younger years. Genuine emotion, hard-won wisdom, and the authentic expression of a soul that had survived its own destruction. On February 11th, 2012, Whitney Houston was found dead in a bathtub at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. The official cause of death was accidental drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. She was 48 years old, just 4 years older than Aretha had been when she delivered her warning backstage at the Grammys 25 years earlier. When Aretha heard the news of Whitney's death, she was devastated but not surprised. She had seen this ending coming since that night in 1987 when she looked into young Whitney's eyes and saw a soul in danger. She had tried to intervene, had offered the wisdom of her own painful experiences, but ultimately Whitney had needed to walk her own path, even when that path led to self-destruction. At Whitney's funeral, Aretha performed I Believe in You and Me, the same song Whitney had struggled through at the Academy Awards during the height of her addiction. But this time, Aretha's rendition was a prayer, a tribute, and a final goodbye to a talent that had burned too bright and too fast. After the funeral, Aretha gave a rare interview about her relationship with Whitney. "I told her that success without soul is suicide," Aretha said, her voice heavy with grief. "I didn't mean it literally, but in a way, that's what happened. She sacrificed her soul for success, and when she tried to get it back, the damage was already done." When Aretha Franklin died in 2018, 6 years after Whitney, those who knew both women reflected on the tragic parallel of their relationship. Aretha had survived the very destruction she had tried to save Whitney from, but she had fought battles of her own to do so. Her warning to Whitney had come from genuine love and hard-won experience. Today, the backstage conversation between Aretha Franklin and Whitney Houston has become legendary in music industry circles. It's taught in artist management courses as an example of the importance of maintaining artistic integrity. It's referenced by young artists who struggle with the pressure to compromise their authentic selves for commercial success. Jennifer Hudson, who portrayed Aretha in the 2021 film Respect, and who was herself mentored by both Aretha and Whitney at different times, spoke about the significance of that 1987 encounter. "Aretha understood something that took Whitney too long to learn. Your gift is connected to your soul, And if you lose your soul chasing success, you lose the very thing that made you special in the first place. The warning Aretha gave Whitney that night, "Success without soul is suicide," has taken on new resonance in an era of social media and reality television, where young artists face even more pressure to commodify every aspect of their lives and personalities. The struggle Whitney faced between authenticity and commercial viability is now amplified 1,000 times over by platforms that demand constant content and perfect images. But perhaps the most poignant legacy of Aretha's warning is how Whitney herself tried to pass it on before she died. In one of her final interviews, Whitney was asked what advice she would give to young artists just starting their careers. Her answer echoed the words Aretha had spoken to her in that backstage hallway. "Know who you are before fame tells you who you should be," Whitney said, "and never sacrifice your soul for success, because I promise you the success won't last, but the damage to your soul will." It was a lesson learned too late for Whitney to fully save herself, but perhaps not too late to save someone else. Somewhere, a young artist with a beautiful voice and impossible expectations is hearing Whitney's story and Aretha's warning. Maybe this time, someone will listen before it's too late. This powerful story reminds us that the people who challenge us most are often the people who love us most. Aretha Franklin saw Whitney Houston's destruction coming and tried to prevent it, but some lessons can only be learned through painful experience. The tragedy isn't just that Whitney didn't listen, it's that by the time she understood Aretha's warning, the damage was already done. Who in your life has tried to warn you about something you weren't ready to hear? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear Aretha's wisdom today. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because we have more incredible stories that reveal the real human cost of fame and the warnings we all wish we had heeded sooner.